So they're bringing their sick, believing that Jesus will heal them. And Jesus is just making a name for himself. The crowd is drawing in. And so this is where we pick up in chapter 7, which is titled, That Which Defiles. So I'm going to be reading from the NIV, chapter 7, verse 1 to 23. And I think it will come up on the screen. Yeah. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. And so the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares what might have been used to help your father or mother is korban, that is devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And you do so many things like that." Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what that comes out of a person that defiles them." And after he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their hearts, but into their stomach, and then out of their body." In saying this, Jesus declares all food clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." It's a long passage, isn't it? So our passage starts with the Pharisees coming along to see what Jesus is up to. And that's not particularly surprising or particularly unusual, because Jesus is creating this crowd that he is teaching the Jewish people, and they want to know what he's teaching. Is he teaching something that is true? Is he a false prophet? And so they want to come and evaluate what Jesus is doing, what he is teaching. And so they pitch up in chapter 7. Part of the role of the Pharisees was to know the scriptures, to teach, to guide the Jewish people. And yet, instead of noticing all of what Jesus is doing, feeding people, healing, teaching, walking on water, they look at his friends and they say, "Hey, look at these guys. They're not even doing the basics properly. They're not even washing their hands properly before they eat." The Pharisees missed out. They arrived to see Jesus. They knew the scriptures better than anyone else. They were primed to be the first to notice that maybe this guy, maybe he was the Messiah that they had been waiting for. And yet they missed it. Everyone around Jesus who met him so briefly were impacted by him, by his healing, his teaching. Their lives were being changed from a moment with Jesus. And yet the Pharisees miss out. They don't have this type of encounter with Jesus. Why? Well, they came to criticize. They came with an attitude ready to look for faults. Their hearts were not there to listen. They weren't there to observe or to understand. They thought they knew better. And as soon as there was something to criticize, they jumped on it. It made me think, I wonder how much we miss out of encountering Jesus because our hearts are too set to criticize. They're too cynical, maybe bitter or angry. We, like the Pharisees, we can be so close to Jesus, so close to what Jesus is doing, that he's moving around us, but we miss it because we're so concerned with our traditions, our expectations, that we can become consumed with ourselves, our feelings, our place in church, that we miss what Jesus is doing right in front of us. So the Pharisees, they've arrived, they criticize Jesus' followers, his closest friends. What does Jesus do about it? Well, he doesn't do what I expect the Pharisees and maybe those around expected him to do. He doesn't whisper to his disciples, "You're embarrassing me. What are you doing? You couldn't just wash your hands properly." No. Jesus doesn't question his disciples. He doesn't question their behavior. He doesn't say any of those things. He turns to probably the surprised Pharisees and he calls them hypocrites. It was really quite harsh. He quotes the scriptures at them, which would have really hit home, saying that their hearts are far from him. Their worship is in vain. Jesus responds to the Pharisees saying, although you're supposed to be closest to God, you're not. You're doing all this action trying to earn God's love, and yet Jesus is saying to them, it doesn't matter. It's actually all in vain. Now, Jesus doesn't brush their comments under the carpet. He doesn't ignore them. He addresses them. He doesn't change the subject. And he doesn't offer an explanation for why the disciples are not eating the way the Pharisees want them to eat. But he responds by looking at the Pharisees' hearts and telling them they have got no place to criticize others. Jesus clearly gets angry with the Pharisees, which I feel is for two reasons. Firstly, the Pharisees have put their traditions above God's law. The tradition of the elders was just that. It was man-made traditions. Jesus becomes really angry about this because they're adding human rules to divine laws and they are calling them divine. They're adding man-made ideas to God's holy scriptures and treating them as equal. The Pharisees were known to push, to emphasize the tradition of the elders and argue that that was equal to the Bible. This is not simply a hygiene issue, because you read it and think, well, maybe you should wash your hands before you eat. It's not actually about that. It's not about them simply not washing their hands. They hadn't washed their hands according to the rituals that the Pharisees had told them to do. And so the Pharisees were horrified. They were believing that Jesus' closest friends were defiling themselves by not washing correctly before they ate and becoming unclean. So let's have a look. God's law says in Exodus 30, priests are to wash their hands before offering a sacrifice. Okay, that's what the Bible said. The tradition of the elders was that all people are to wash before eating. It's a little bit different. Priests, before they offer a sacrifice, all people before eating. Jesus accuses the Pharisees of letting go of what God has commanded and putting their traditions first. They have made their traditions their idols, something that has become before God, before God's law. And so apparently the Pharisees created these as a type of hedge law. So to stop anyone from getting anywhere close to sinning, they could create this law, this hedge around it to stop anyone sinning. A helpful barrier to stop people getting too close to sin. But yet, this didn't create that. It created more separation. It created more things for people to do, to remember, to not forget, to follow the rules, making it harder and harder to live a holy life. Jesus upheld the laws of God, the laws set by Moses, but not the additional ones created by tradition. And if you've read much of the gospel, you will see this angered the Pharisees, and is probably one of, if not one of the main reasons that led to Jesus being killed on a cross. And so clearly, this is something that Jesus takes seriously. So my second point about why Jesus responds the way he does is that the Pharisees were seen to be different and separate. And actually, the term Pharisee means separated ones. I expect Jesus became angry with them because everything of this tradition of the elders, of what the Pharisees stood for, were being separated, creating rules which made them feel good and everybody else feel bad, because they just couldn't quite keep up. Of course, Jesus speaks up against the Pharisees because Jesus' message was for all. Jesus' message is the absolute opposite of what the Pharisees are doing. Jesus' message was about grace and not about rules to earn your acceptance. Jesus doesn't want anyone to miss out on knowing their maker, of being part of God's family. And so to have the Pharisees coming in and who don't genuinely love people, excluding his friends, his disciples, makes Jesus react very strongly to them. Philip Yancey says this: in a nutshell, the Bible, from Genesis 3 to Revelation 22, tells the story of a God reckless with desire to get his family back. The Pharisees thought if they could obey enough, if they could earn God's love. But Jesus comes to suffer on a cross so that everyone is included, everyone belongs. And there's nothing that you could do to earn that salvation but simply accepting God's grace. You see, Jesus always loves first. Let me tell you a little story and see if maybe you can relate. When I was 16 years old, I had a friend. She's still my friend, but she was a really good friend of mine, and we were both Christians. And the rest of my sort of group of friends weren't really Christians. And so my Christian friend, she went along to a church camp, and she came back and she had all these new Christian friends. And I thought, that's great. We've got all these new Christians we can introduce to our friends, and we can all be this big group of friends. But it didn't quite work out like that because they didn't accept me. So although I was a Christian, I didn't go to the same church that they went to. And they felt that the way I acted as a Christian wasn't quite good enough to how they behaved as a Christian. And so instead of being part of something, I was judged. I reacted to this I was quite angry. I didn't feel drawn to go to their church or to be part of their group. It put me off. I felt not worthy, not good enough. There was a man-made bar of judgment put against me, and I couldn't get through it. There were expectations on me which I didn't even know about, and because of that, I missed them, and I was out. I was labeled, you're not good enough. And I wonder if the disciples felt like that. I think when we're judged, we can respond with anger and not wanting to have anything to do with it. Or we can start to believe it. We can start to think, yeah, maybe I'm not quite good enough. And I wonder if the disciples already wondered that they weren't worthy to be Jesus' closest friends. Sometimes we can take this, you're not good enough, to heart and start to believe that we're not worthy to be here. We've just made too many mistakes. Let me tell you an opposite example. My son Jack had a birthday recently, and he wanted a family game of football. So we invited everyone, late 60s to 2 years old, were invited to this family game of football. Jack divided everyone into two teams, red team to represent Manchester United, and a white team to represent England, because of course those two teams play against each other. Anyway, so people arrived. It was a Saturday afternoon in Hawley. It was cold, it wasn't quite raining, but it was on the edge. They arrived dressed in their red or their white, and they played football, whether they liked football or whether they didn't, whether they were 66 or whether they were 2, they pitched up and they got stuck in. They got involved. Why? Because Jack asked them to. Jack was loved, and he is loved by his family before he did anything. He was the first grandchild on both sides, so he was just this wanted, loved child. Before he took his first breath, he was loved. Jack has an army behind him, which he may not even realize that he has. But whenever he's in a football match or a Christmas play, there's people who are there to support him. He has people who will show up for him every time to help him or just to make him happy. The example of my son is like Jesus' message. He's loved immediately, and he didn't do anything to earn it. God does this. Think about our the Israelites in Egypt. God rescues them out of slavery, out of Egypt. What had they done to deserve that kind of rescue? The waters part, they walk through, they see amazing things. What did they do to earn that, to deserve it? Not a lot, if anything. God rescues them first, and then he restores them. Then he gives them his laws. God doesn't look at them first and say, right, well, these are the rules. See if you can live by them, and then I'll rescue you. No, he rescues them, takes them away from slavery, and then says, okay, live like this. The woman caught in adultery, just imagine the scene. This woman is brought in for the Pharisees to make an example out of Jesus. She is so undervalued by her accusers, she's used as a trick. I wonder if she could even see Jesus, or if she was just this heap on the floor waiting for the stones to start coming. I wonder if she even saw, or if she heard people starting to walk away. Stones that were meant to be for her being dropped on the ground. And then Jesus comes to her. Getting my words out. Jesus comes to her, meets with her. She encounters him. He doesn't condemn her, but he then says, okay, sin no more. This passage repeats that it's on the inside that comes out of you, that makes you unclean, that defiles you. It is your heart. How is your heart changed? Well, it can only ever be changed by Jesus. Once you have been loved, you to do. Maybe you've not been raised in a family like that which Jack was born into. Maybe you were taught conditional love. You need to achieve first and then you will be loved. Reach these goals, keep trying, no, not quite good enough, keep going, and then maybe you'll just get to that point of being loved enough. You are part of God's family now. Read the Bible and realize what Philip Yancey says is true. God has been on a mission to get you back, to love you first. What Christianity offers the world is hope. Does your faith in Jesus, do the lives we lead offer hope to those around us, or judgment? When people confide in us, when they're upset, when they're angry, or we're simply having a quick catch-up, are they left feeling loved, accepted, and valued? Because that's how they would leave if they had just met with Jesus. Do we offer any of that in the interactions that we have with our children, with our families, our friends, or our colleagues? So who do you relate to most in this story? Let's start with the Pharisees. I know for me, I've often read the Bible and assumed I'm nothing like them. That's not me. And maybe you have too, but aren't we? Well, we too can feel the need to earn God's love. That if we do enough, if we keep enough traditions, expectations, that we can earn our place in God's family. We too can easily fall into a judgment trap. Show some Pharisee-like tendencies, separating ourselves, treating others as though they don't matter or that they don't live up to our expectations. I wonder if we've ever put our own agenda or our own view of church and how it should look above being loving and accepting of those around us or of our leaders. Traditions and expectations are, of course, not a bad thing. We have so many traditions that are positive, that bring us closer to Jesus. Habits are good for us. They help us create patterns that keep us meeting together, functioning as Christians. But it's when we put those traditions equal or above the Bible, it becomes idolatry, and God doesn't like it because it often not only keeps us away from God, but those around us. Because when they see us judging them, they think, I don't actually want to be a part of that. And I actually think that this Pharisee-like tendency, this preoccupation with we need to stick to the rules, stick to the traditions, the expectations we put on ourselves and on others, applies to every single one of us. And to assume that it doesn't is dangerous. Christians over the last 2,000 years have done some pretty amazing things. But let's be honest, they've done some awful things too. Historically, we've got crusades, we've got wars, we've got Catholics and Protestants killing each other. We've got churches having signs outside saying black people can't come in. It's horrific to look back and think that's what Christians did. And you might think, well, that's not us anymore. We don't do any of that. Well, we may not be murdering people because of our faith, but I think it could be naive of us to think that this doesn't apply to us in some way, that we too could lose sight of Jesus when our traditions and expectations are put in front of that. What about the disciples? Relate to them? I wonder how the disciples felt being judged, but then restored by Jesus' response. Maybe like my small example, you've had times when you felt the religiousness, the legalism of Christianity has been ugly and it's hurt you. Maybe you've been on the receiving end like the disciples, where you felt judged, not good enough, and there are some pretty tough expectations being put on you. Well, maybe you need to hear Jesus standing up for you like he stood up for his disciples. You may have been judged by other people, and sadly that may well have been in this church, but I pray that you know that that was not by Jesus, because he will always love you first. Like my son has from his family, you have an army of angels behind you. The Bible says, if God is for me, I think we read that and just carry on. If God is for you, who could ever stand against you? They don't stand a chance, do they? What about the crowd? We've not even mentioned them yet. Jesus draws them in. He wants them to know that they do not need to be taken down by all these additional rules and laws, because none of that is going to disqualify them from being part of God's family. No, he wants their heart. Jesus wants you to hear it's about your heart. As some of you might know, I'm a social worker. I work with people who want to foster and to adopt. And my job is to assess if they're suitable. One part of that role is to get lots and lots of checks and references. It takes a long time, and it's quite hard work doing that part. But one of it is speaking to the friends and family, speaking to the people who want to do this, the closest people to them, and hearing what they have to say about what this person wants to do, being a foster carer or adopt. And one of the questions I ask referees is from a child who has been in foster care, who's been looked after. And this is the question I ask them. How do you know the person, the foster carer, really likes children and they're not just putting on a show? Such a good question, isn't it? A child who's going to live with a stranger, which is what a foster carer is at the start, wants to know if the person really likes children. Because if it's an act, it's not going to last. People who genuinely enjoy being around children will choose to be around them. They'll find it easier to love them, to understand them, and to care for them. So I wonder if you are brave enough to ask yourself this. Is my faith in Jesus genuine, or is it a bit of a show? Where is your heart? You may be at a time in your life where in your heart you're criticizing, you're finding fault, you're giving judgment. Or maybe you're like Jesus, you're loving first and you're defending those who are being accused and you're offering hope. But I think if we're honest, we all have times of both. I think if, when I asked that question, you thought, yeah, I'm going through the motions a bit. Maybe my heart's not in this faith as much as it was. Well, don't let that disqualify you. Just come back. Give your heart to God again. Admit to yourself and to God that maybe you've been preoccupied with the laws, with fixations, with becoming so focused on yourself and what's best for you, or what's doing the right thing. And you've forgotten your first love. God loves you first. If you choose him in your heart and love him back, you will be changed from the inside out. It is out of a place of being loved that we become aware of the areas in our life where we have become legalistic. So let's ask God how to love first, how to point out people in our lives where we need to be showing God's love and compassion. So lastly, please leave church today knowing this. You are loved by a God who is reckless with desire to have you in his family. He accepts you as you are. You are totally enough. You are loved and rescued first. All he wants is your heart. Because from your heart, he can call you into places and things that he has asked for you to do. Thank you.